Hey everybody, we'll get started in just a minute. I'd just like to invite you to check out the questions on the screen and feel free to put your responses in the chat.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules to be with us for this webinar. Let me just get my stuff set up. Here's the webinar. Okay. Okay, so for the next hour and some change, we are going to be talking about nonprofit intermediaries. And we're going to be rooting this in some takeaways that my business partner Peter and I gathered as we recently conducted a national landscape scan. But before we dive into that too deeply, let's take a step back. Um, just looking at the registration list, it's clear that people are coming from a variety of spaces geographically, but also I'm assuming all of your engagements with the term intermediary is different because you have so many different backgrounds. So let's not take for granted that we're even all on the same page when we say that term. And then yes, at some point we are actually going to take a minute and say who we are, who the people are who have convened you around this topic. So before we dive all the way in, I just want to reiterate that if you saw whether you saw the email invite or not, the impetus for us to do the national landscape scan that we're going to be referring to was that we were hired by an intermediary to do the scan and create something that was specific to them. So we zoomed out, we did the scan, but then we zoomed in to create an assessment tool that was specific to that organization. But then, as you know, we had the chance to talk to these different organizations. You know, Peter and I were like, well, there are definitely some implications for the broader nonprofit ecosystem. So that's what we want to talk to you about today. But like I said, let's talk about what an intermediary is. And throughout this talk, we're going to be drawing on quotes and what we heard from folks in the field.
And we should
I
mention
just
this is
want
just a small bit of a much, as Janae said, a much larger project. And also, everything that we mention here isn't our necessarily, in fact, not our ideas. These are things that we heard kind of from the field that we're reflecting back to the field. We have lots of our own ideas, but we really wanted to gather together and reflect back those things that we heard from folks out across the country.
Yeah, and as we get started, I do want to give a shout out to the organization that originally commissioned us. I know you're in the room, but I also don't know. I don't want to put you on Front Street, but this is what the work has led to. So thank you for the invitation to partner with you on that. Okay, so I just invite you to sit with this quote for a minute as we think about what an intermediary is and the unique role that they play in the nonprofit ecosystem. I mean, clearly you have enough of an idea of what an intermediary is anyway that you showed up here today. But I think this is both funny and true, right? They're in this weird in-between space. Throughout this talk, as we refer to the clients that we've heard from, we're just identifying them with a pin and like the geography of their state. So if at some point you're from one of those organizations and you want to raise your hand and say something, that's fine. But because we didn't get their explicit, consent to put their business out in the street in this public venue or format, we're not using their names.
And as we go along, I'll be monitoring the chat. Janae will be doing most of the narrative. So if you have any questions along the way or comments, feel free to put them in the chat.
Okay, so why intermediaries? Why is it worthwhile to spend a lunch hour thinking about or engaging around this particular type of organization? Let's take a step back. Once again, not taking for granted that we're even all on the same page when we use that term. What role do they play in the nonprofit ecosystem? Once again, throughout the slides, the pin will represent intermediary organizations themselves, but look at all these connection points to government, to volunteers, to philanthropy, to residents and activists, to the corporate community, and also to small business, local business. The lines are meant to showcase the different lines, the different channels through which relationships, expertise, also power and information are traveling. So think about the flow of money. Like there's traditional philanthropy, what we think of as institutional philanthropy, but then there are also organizations one of which is represented on this call that, is doing some interesting work engaging like non-traditional donors. In terms of expertise, we talk to technical assistance providers, but then there are also those who facilitate connections to more specific forms of expertise and on and on. Peter, did you have anything to add?
No, I think it's just really important that as we looked at this, I think one of the common misperceptions in the nonprofit sector is that, oh, intermediaries are just a different type of nonprofit. And that's often true, but oftentimes they get treated like other nonprofits. And I think there's a sort of a discontinuity in there, and we'll go into that a little bit more. But these are kind of unique roles, and of course, different intermediaries play different kinds of roles and different emphases. And there's organizations that aren't, all intermediaries. That's maybe one of the things they do. There's others that's all that they do. So there's a real diversity, but they tend to be kind of like collaboratives as well. These kind of unique entities, I think, oftentimes get looked at through a I don't know what the appropriate, maybe not the best lens. And so we want to try to sort of unveil and maybe uncover some of what we heard from folks out in the field.
Yeah, and just on a last note, so what, so going back to this question of why intermediaries, what are some things that can be accomplished working with intermediaries that can't be accomplished through direct funding to frontline organizations? One of them is reaching early stage organizations. I mean, theoretically, a foundation with $1 billion endowment could create the capacity to work with smaller organizations, but we know that often that is not what happens. They rely on intermediaries to do that. The ability to build trust with and be in community. Um, Intermediaries often perform this function of sort of coordination and convening as well that takes them above an individual organization to really convene multiple players. And then also capacity building, leadership development that benefits the entire sector beyond the impact on one organization. Okay, so that's why we're here, and that's what we're here to talk about, these types of organizations, and hopefully we're all on the same page that they are worth spending an hour talking about. Before we dive into that, though, we should probably take a step back and just tell you who the heck we are for those of us who don't know you. Peter, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Peter Nicholson. I work with Janae at Foresight Collective, and for the last 20 some odd years before Foresight Collective, I led an organization called Foresight Design Initiative, and we were focused on both sustainability and social impact in a whole variety of different capacities, from consulting to education programs to experiential learning, et cetera. So I've been working in the nonprofit sector for more than 25 years now. Yeah, Janae?
Yeah, so Janae Gilmore, and like I said, I started my career and have spent most of my career at an intermediary organization. So this is clearly a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Um, I'm just going to say it out loud. Shamil and Amber are still at Michigan Community Resources, but that is where I got my entry point into this work. And I'm also going to put it out in the street, like they're the ones who hired us to do the scan. So it was like a homecoming for me. And we really appreciated the opportunity to work with them in that way. Okay, so you know a little bit about who we are. I'm on the east side of Detroit. Peter's in Chicago. He comes up a couple times a month, but that's where our team is based. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the scan. We had a chance to interview 9 different organizations, which once again are identified by their geographies in these pins. And then, of course, we did internet research. We read up on other organizations. We actually built out a catalog of intermediaries for our client. And then we're also channeling, to some extent, our lessons and observations from just having been out in the field doing this work for so many years.
Janae, how many organizations are in that database that you created that we looked at?
25 in the final version. We cut it down to 25.
In every shape, size that you can imagine, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what about intermediaries though? What are we going to be digging into for the next little time that we're together? The first question is, why are intermediaries under strain? So as we talked to these different organizations, that was one theme that kept emerging, like their budgets are stretched. The organizations, in many cases, were feeling the stretch. One thing that we observed and that we want to talk about with you today, though, is like the why behind that. And I know like the temptation is to say, you know what? They just need more money. Say that about any other organization in the nonprofit sector, probably. If they had more funding, we wouldn't even need to have this webinar. But in fact, as we listened to these organizations, there were some patterns that emerged that we felt were worth naming. So the idea is the more nuanced the diagnosis, the more specific and nuanced the treatment can be. So we're going to start off by sharing some information related to these patterns, related to 6 patterns that we saw. And I suspect that if you've been doing work in the sector for any amount of time, these will resonate with you. After we go through the patterns, then we're going to get into, okay, but then how do we address this so that we can move towards more resilience and more innovation in the intermediary space? Um, I don't want to assume that this goes without saying. So we're gonna be sharing information during the first part of this, and it'll get more interactive later. But if you have any questions or observations in the meantime, we ask that you activate the chat. And also, as you see some questions for reflection, that's like for more internal reflection, feel free to drop, a comment in the chat, but we'll get to that more discussion-based part afterwards. Okay, so let's start by just taking in this quote. And I wonder if in your minds you're already thinking of the pattern we might be referring to. You might use different language, but I think you can already tell what direction we might be going in. Funder pet project syndrome. That is the number one pattern that stood out to us as we talked to these different organizations. And what do we mean by that? I'm sure intuitively you already have a sense of where we're going with this, but the idea is that maybe a funder creates something or they see something out in the field that they get really excited about and they start the investment, and then, I don't know, a board member sneezes, times change, a crisis hits, and they're no longer as interested or excited. And oftentimes the loss of interest results in a funding cliff for the intermediary organization, which is left wondering, like, how are we going to sustain the program? And then, of course, the beneficiaries of those programs wondering, well, how are we going to be able to get these resources? So if that's what we're seeing today, if that's what is, one question for reflection that we invite you to carry with you is, what might it look like to fund intermediaries as essential infrastructure, not projects? So instead of seeing the thing, getting excited about the thing, investing in the thing as if it was a time-limited thing, like what would it look like to just invest in the levees before the hurricane or the storm?
Janae, I think one of the difficult things about this with foundations is many foundations, at least in my observation, are reluctant to, we don't want to take something on that's going to feel like a burden, that we have to continually, quote, prop up or continually fund, right? And I look at this and I get that. And, they want to have flexible capital and be able to deploy it in different ways over time. But I also see the need to, like, hey, you got to invest in a certain amount of basic infrastructure. It's just like utilities, right? You got to have an electric, you got to have your internet, you got to have your water, right? And there's a basic funding. And I think it's a different perspective, but it'd be interesting if there's any funders or anyone wants to have a conversation about that, to talk about that dynamic, because I know funders are really, when they see something that's, oh, it's going to be an ongoing long-term commitment, they, oh, I don't know. And I also realize that funders are, oftentimes responding to board members and things like that. They're different dynamics. But I think that's one of the dynamics often at play like this. Hey, we don't really recognize that there are sort of baseline needs that need to be met in the nonprofit sort of ecosystem.
hmm And I would be remiss, just because of who I am, if I didn't respond to that, Peter, with, at Foresight Collective, our goal is to really rethink, reimagine, challenge systems, but we also recognize the constraints that we're under today. Like, the poor you will always have with you. That's so there are going to be some ongoing needs and structures and things that we're not necessarily getting at. I even have on a t-shirt today that speaks to the activism and advocacy that I do outside of my day job because I do want to push against those structures. But so we recognize those limitations, but within the context of the systems that we have today, we're asking you to reflect on what can we do. Okay, and so now we're moving on to pattern number 2. And I'll just give you a minute to take in this quote, and then we'll see the pattern. Cutting infrastructure in a crisis. Okay, so what's prioritized when an emergency happens? Well, support to direct service organizations, right? I mean, and that does make sense. At the same time, going back to our first point, what would it look like to fund intermediaries as infrastructure and invest in them consistently on the front end? So once again, you know, do we want to invest once the bridge is already compromised, or do we want to invest so that it remains structurally sound in the first place? And then a question that we invite you to consider there is, how might we develop resilience by investing in intermediaries before a crisis? So related to, but not exactly the same thing as our first point.
And here in Chicago, there's an intermediary, kind of a collaborative intermediary. It's a very kind of dynamic organization serving the Latino population. I love to use it as an example because they really invested over time in developing relationships and trusted relationships before there was a crisis, before just because they were all in sort of the same community area and had the same racial identity that they came together and served different purposes. But then when COVID hit, they were acknowledged as one of the more high functioning organizations. And same thing when we were having issues here in Chicago with ICE and the ramping up of ICE. They were also highly effective because they had taken the time to invest in those kinds of things. And I think it's also from a funder's point of view, that time that it takes to create those relationships is like, well, you're not really doing anything. In a certain sense, well, I get that. You don't have necessarily any immediate impacts, but boy, when a crisis hits, it's really clear those networks, those collaborators, those intermediaries that have that resilience and those that don't. Yeah, Lisa, did you have a question? We'll take a question along the way, or you can put
Yeah,
it in the chat. Go
yes,
ahead.
Peter. I just wanted to add to that. In 20 years as a participatory grant maker, slash intermediary, some of the big fights, we've been 20 years, some of the early fights and some of the fights that continue to come along are, yes, there's the investment. And I don't think traditional philanthropy is opposed to investing in the pre-work, but a lot of the work that intermediaries do are people work.
Mm-hmm.
That is not something that traditional philanthropy can get their minds around. And it's difficult and it's a constant struggle when you start talking about impact. They're accustomed to counting widgets. How many children were you able to graduate? How many, when you start talking about relationship building, that is about people being on the ground, connecting with other people, connecting with groups and individuals and leaders and development. That doesn't fit well through my observations and experience with traditional philanthropy. And that's always been a huge fight. So whether they're interested in investing in the front end or not, being able to pledge and understand the model about investing in people just isn't there. It's like running up against the brick wall. That's been something that's been continuous for me in my work.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I think one of the issues that I've seen, and I completely agree, I think one of the issues is the evaluation frameworks that are used. And oftentimes a more programmatic evaluation framework is used both with collaboratives and with intermediaries, and they don't necessarily fit the work. That's not the same thing as how many kids did you teach to read, or how many meals did you serve, or those kinds of things. And one of my mantras in this work over decades is sometimes the most impactful data is the hardest to get and the hardest to kind of quantify. But I totally appreciate that comment. Yeah, and we'll have some time. I appreciate if anyone does have a compelling, something that's on their mind they want to share. Let's maybe Janae, you and I will pivot a little bit, and just raise your hand like Lisa did, and we'll call on you or put it in the chat. We will have time at the end for some more conversations. There's enough people here that we can, I think, kind of have an open conversation a little bit at the end, but I'll also respond to folks in the chat. Janae, back to you.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, Lisa, and I don't want to lose that point because I feel like we're going to circle back to that towards the end. So this idea of narrative and how do we communicate in a way that might get the people on board. Okay, but for now, going back to another diagnosis that we want to wrap some language around. Maybe you've had time to sit with this quote by now. And we just called this locked in, no room to pivot. Now, you can tell from the language why this group may not be locked in. And we have a quote that we're going to juxtapose to this one so you can see how their situation is unique than some of the other situations that we heard. But how are you meant to respond when there's a flurry of executive orders, or there's a natural disaster, or there's some event, some shift, and you just literally don't have the unrestricted dollars that are going to allow you to move and be fluid? So to that point, started off seeing a quote from this organization about how they approach funding. And then as a result, we invite you to take in this quote as well about how they're able to shift their strategy and move in response to what's going on. And so our invitation for you then is to consider what is possible when intermediaries are able to pivot in general, and then especially in a crisis.
And I think our observation, Janae, correct me if I'm wrong, is that many intermediaries do evolve over time because they tend to have close relationships with the folks they're working with. They can be responsive and see needs early on and sort of grow. I think we saw that with a lot of the folks we talked to. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not across the board that this locked-in phenomenon exists. We also saw what is working, right? The title is What's Not Working, What Is Working, and What Could Be. And what we heard from multiple organizations is that because of the strength and depth of their relationships in community, I mean, with their, I guess, constituency, and also in the funding community, they were positioned to evolve and to really respond to the needs of the moment. So yeah.
Just think of this organization I mentioned before here in Chicago. It was they had one set of activities before COVID. They completely pivoted during COVID, and they had to pivot again in certain respects during the sort of the ICE ramp up that we had here.
Okay, so then the next organization, just gonna let you sit with this quote for a minute. And then once again, we're going to give the language for the diagnosis of the pattern that we're talking about here. we have to serve everyone syndrome, is what we called this pattern. But intermediaries um, have the ability to touch a lot of groups and meet a lot of serve them in different ways. And this question of who to target and with what services and what the trade-offs are as they do that was definitely a theme that spoke to us as we listened to different organizations and engaged. So this is an organization, as you see, that made a decision that they are going to channel their energy and their resources towards working with certain groups, kind of at the exclusion at this point of working with others, but they had their reasons. So then a question that we invite you to sit with as we reflect on this together is, what gets lost when intermediaries try to meet everyone's needs, when they don't do what this organization did? And that was a tension point that I would say that folks responded to differently across the different types of organizations or the different organizations that we spoke with. Some, had in a way, drawn a line in the sand, like, this is who we serve and why. Like, this is how we get the revenue to serve this group. And because we don't have the revenue to serve this group, we don't. Others struggle with it a bit more, but we're not pretending that we have cut and dry answers for what we saw, but this is what we saw.
And I think we shouldn't underestimate this. This can be a really, for lack of a better term, painful question. You don't want to exclude people, but at the same time, you have to, if you're, especially your fee for service, right? And we'll get to this in the next one. There are tensions, right? You have to meet your bottom line. You have to meet your payroll. You have to get a certain amount of income. And so how do you balance this tension? Like, well, we want to be inclusive and we want to be broad based. At the same time, is that market going to serve what we need to do to survive as an organization? So I think there can be a real tension here. We don't want to underestimate or sort of scan over that.
Okay, and then our next pattern, once again, here's the quote. As I said, for those of you who joined a little bit later, just for the sake of preserving people's anonymity, unless they want to come off and say, hey, that was me, that's my quote, we took out the names and just are using the pen and the geography to identify the different organizations that we pulled these quotes from. And just in case it's not clear from this quote, going back to this tension between who you can afford to serve, or the trade-offs in determining who you target. We spoke to an organization through the scan who at one point had a fund, had a donor for a fund, and those funds were used to subsidize or actually cover the cost of capacity building for smaller organizations. Once the funds ran out and they weren't able to build the fund back up, or they have yet to be able to build the fund back up, the reality is they serve the organizations who can afford their services. But the ED is still committed to going out there and trying to fundraise to build that fund back up. And we called this fee-for-service models that leave smaller organizations behind. Once again, just acknowledging that tension point. And so our question for us all to ponder, and I guess for our broader nonprofit ecosystem to ponder, is what gets lost or gained when an intermediary's reliance on earned revenue leaves less capacity to serve smaller organizations. Felicia, did you come off mute because you wanted to say something?
Sorry, I didn't get a chance to see the last slide. I looked away for a second.
Okay.
Sorry.
Nope, no worries at all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, we've heard ideas across the spectrum on this. So once again, we're not pretending like these tensions or these trade-offs are easy, but these are things that we observed.
It's something we should mention too, that Janae and I, as consultants, we've encountered as well. We worked with a client last year that was very low resourced, and we were able to do it because we had clients that were more resourced, and we were really committed, and we also had to modify how we engaged with that client, and it was, I think it was a kind of a source for innovation in terms of our service delivery. And the kind of surprising thing is that client kind of really, I think, was one of our success stories. They really excelled, despite the fact that for us it was kind of a low touch and low bono, as Janae taught me the word, undertaking for us. But it's I think for all of us that do this kind of work, it's a real important question.
Yeah, and I mean, I see that there are a few consultants on the call. I feel like you'll be able to resonate with this idea. Like sometimes you work with the folks with more money so that you can do the hard work with folks that may not necessarily have the same level of resources. So, okay, I think we might be coming up on our last diagnoses. No, second to last diagnoses. Okay, so this is another instance in which we use two quotes sort of juxtaposed against each other for an idea. And neither one of them is wrong, you know, no lies told here, New York. But then the syndrome that we're diagnosing here is assuming that more funding is the answer. And we want to unpack that a little bit. And when you see the next quote, I think it'll be clearer. Okay, so this is a very long quote. I'll leave you to read it, give you a minute, and then sort of dig into the backstory. Okay, in a way, this takes us back to where we started from with funder pet project syndrome. Except in this instance, the funders were going all in, 8 to 9 years. We're committed. At the same time, in a context where an organization is experiencing exponential growth, hiring a lot of folks, what we learned through talking with this group is that has an impact on an organization's or can have an impact on an organization's internal infrastructure. One, just like how are we internally dealing with growing and all of these team members and maintaining our internal culture. And then two, connection to the community. So as you get bigger, as you have more resources, you feel like you can do more, you are doing more. Are you centering, staying deeply connected and rooted with the community? And one of the leaders of this organization sort of entreaty to us was tell the organization not to lose that connection to the community, not to lose focus, not to lose their way the way that we did. And this person described sort of the process of feeling like they went from doing radical sort of transformational capacity building to becoming an institution. So 8 to 9 year runway, more money than you know what to do with, aside from hiring more staff people. But still, there were factors that led to this organization experiencing first the boom and then a bust cycle, where they significantly had to reduce their staff and also the services that they were able to provide. Peter, why don't you read this question for us?
What elements could be inflected to create positive internal and external change that don't just require additional funding? And so I think a lot of time, and we don't mean to, that's why we said not just funding, but I did a project once several years ago looking at mental health issues on college campuses, a specific college campus with some students. And one of the frameworks we gave ourselves, because we knew the college wasn't going to invest anything in this, no matter how good of an argument we made, perhaps, despite the urgency, was this, we have to come up with things that don't cost any money. And we did it. And it's an interesting, I'm trained as a designer. And so designers, we work within constraints. And sometimes those constraints can be the things that really produce insights and transformation and innovation. And in this case, we came up with some really innovative things that I think if we had thought, oh, well, let's pretend like we have all the money in the world. Oh, well, we just need to hire X, Y, and Z, and, that'll make everything better. I think the solutions and the insights we came up with were better because we gave ourselves that real world constraint.
Yeah, and I want to go back to this point about relationships because another organization, which even though we didn't quote them for the purposes of this presentation, one of the things that we left our conversation with them with is this. In addition to like they also were experiencing funder pet project syndrome, but they were still in the well-resourced phase of things, although they could already tell the tide was turning because of a lot of the activities that went on last year. The executive director kept bringing up relationship and how she made time to meet people face to face. And when she was working with younger people, she noticed that they would rely a lot on emails and different forms of like virtual communication. But she said, no, I go out, like I'm in the community and I schedule coffees because the relationships, kind of to Lisa's point, that's the wealth, that is that infrastructure, that is that glue that will sustain the work. Okay, I misinformed you. That was the last of the diagnostics. So here's a summary of where we've been, sort of naming those patterns, and also asking what could be with those reflection questions. And now we have a question that we want to invite you to consider. So what will it take to foster more vibrant and resilient intermediaries and a more resilient and vibrant nonprofit ecosystem?
And I'll just suggest if folks haven't been looking at the chat, Shamil just put a long, very insightful kind of note in there. And Shamil, I don't know if you want to unmute and sort of kick off this conversation and build on what you said, or what's the response? What's I think you have a really acute analysis of what's going on, and again, sort of defining why this is a purgatory kind of place in a lot of ways. You really unpack that in that comment, and thank you for sharing that. I wonder if you want to add anything or, sort of point to what the way is forward.
No, I don't want to. I mean, yes and no. So I do have a lot of thoughts, and I wanted to offer some comments and reflections, just personal reflections. So let me take a step back. Janae acknowledged her own tenure at MCR. Shamil Dobbs with the Michigan Community Resources. We are a local intermediary here alongside Lisa in the work that she does and some other intermediaries. Zeke, I know, is on the call, so COACT is here in Southeast Michigan. So I just wanted to give a little context of who I am and the organization that I serve. But the reflection in the comment was an opportunity for folks to read, absorb, and I would just love to hear if it's resonant for others. I can probably get on my soapbox, and I don't want to do so in this space. But I think there are just some dynamics, especially in the prompts questions that both Peter and Janae asked, and I'm just curious to know how folks are feeling about just the dynamics at play, but also the tensions between how we are situated, funded, and the fact that the reality is if intermediaries were considered part of infrastructure scaffolding and not an ancillary strategy that philanthropy funded, no different from other nonprofits, I think this dynamic and tension would not exist in the way that it does. But that's just not the place that we're in right now. So I would just love to hear from others how they're thinking and feeling about what I said, but also some of the prompt questions that Janae asked.
Thanks, Shamil. Other folks, does anyone want to respond to that or chime in? Alex, I saw you nodding your head. I'm curious what's on your mind. Lisa, I'll circle back to you.
Shamil, thank you so much for laying out what you laid out in the way, both the analysis, the diagnosis and analysis. And I think it just speaks so clearly to where we are. And I think it does suggest some things for in terms of solution. And I think just the concept of infrastructure itself is really resonates with me. So my question for many years has been how to establish it as part of the infrastructure. I think that and I'm sure many of you look to philanthropy and in hopes for kind of a more systemic and organized response in terms of or literally organizing around capacity building rather than doing it very piecemeal, which would go a long way. And I do think that that's a big area where we need to explore and do some kind of movement building, if you will. I'm curious, I guess I have questions. Another part of the diagnostic, I think, is, as Shamil noted, the nonprofit sector, nonprofits are under-resourced and caught in kind of a crisis cycle. And that, unfortunately, I think feeds into the system of kind of fragmentation and, difficulty in demonstrating impact. In some cases, not wise use of capacity building resources because unfortunately nonprofits don't have the attention span typically or really a deep enough understanding of how to engage with some of these supports in ways that could be helpful. So that's a part where it's more difficult to make traction and shift perceptions. But so I guess I have a more of a open question. I think I have some more direct ideas about how philanthropy could be approached in a case, be made less so for kind of addressing the dynamic on the nonprofit level.
Thanks, Alex. I think one thing, Alex, that I've realized, Lisa, I'll get to you for just a second, is we underestimate, we talk about capacity billions, and that word should be very hard to say because it's very hard to do. And I think we underestimate how much time it takes and how much funding it takes to really do it well. And we think webinars or even things like this, whatever the case may be, is enough. And in my experience, both personal experience and also trying to provide it to other people, it's an intensive process oftentimes, and something that has to happen over time. Anyways, Lisa, you wanted to share something.
Yes. Responding to Shamil, well, Shamil bit off the whole baby. I'm not gonna get that big. That's beyond my pay grade. But I want to say, just on its face, the word intermediaries, there are two people at the table, right? And I have grown to understand my role, and I think it's more evident. It seems evident in Detroit in many ways that intermediaries embrace both end of those roles, receiving support to have an impact on different populations, but also to define their role as kind of almost, if you will, which I find a lot of intermediaries are reluctant to do, the antithesis of traditional philanthropy. If we start to have that conversation and understand our role in that, folks want traditional philanthropies to understand so many things and to make adjustments. And the question came to me many years ago of whose job is it to push them to consider those questions and what questions to consider. To me, it's the intermediary's role, right? Although we're supporting communities and nonprofits, I think I've understood my role, and I see many folks in this room, Shamil, Janae, Jane Morgan is our principal evaluator in Detroit. We're often all at the same table having the same conversations, right? And so I think intermediaries, in terms of embracing their role as the one in the middle, has an obligation to push traditional philanthropy. Although I think the existence of intermediaries it answers the question that traditional philanthropies kind of understand that they can't do this or they don't want to do this work with a bunch of community people calling them and figuring out these relationships and these really tough people relationships, and they want somebody else to do it. Uh, I think it's important for us to really define our roles in terms of helping traditional philanthropy understand what they're missing and why they can't or won't do this and why the system's not shifting. The second thing is a systems approach, right? Um, there are some populations that we serve and that we haven't served. We could serve them because they're just a part of different systems. And as an intermediary of 20 years was learned so much about who I am, who the program can be, who it can serve, understanding that it's the value that are applied to the intermediary and to our work that allows us to open up different spaces for other folks to see their way in. Now, the challenge is to connect with traditional funders, who might want to support that work. But if we're going every all the way from civic engagement to community organizing to capacity building to technical assistance, all the things, those are just staples for what we do, if you will. And
Yeah.
any of the systems can we can find our way for any of the systems to be serviced if we hold that model and we hold values. And it's just a matter of us, and it's not just sitting around waiting for funders to find us. It's also if there's folks in need, to build those relationships with other funders, right? And you could do that with partners in the work, like evaluators like Jane. We have very frank discussions, Shamil. So I think Detroit has evolved in that way where folks are at the table together, identifying gaps, realizing what we need together, right? Because when
Yeah.
I think of an
Yeah.
intermediary and the way that we don't operate necessarily in a vacuum to other intermediaries, other nonprofits, evaluation firms. Intermediaries are kind of consolidated with the whole ecosystem of folks that are doing the change making.
Thanks so much, Lisa. You touched on, I think, four of my favorite things in your comments. One is it's people. Number two, it's power and power dynamics between funders and intermediaries, and oftentimes intermediaries they have dual power dynamics, right? Because they're kind of in
Mhm.
between. You talked about systems and interconnections, and then you talked about relationships. And I appreciate that. I think those are all kind of come into play in this topic. Janae Wyona had a question about how do we define intermediaries in the research, and maybe that's something you want to take up.
Yeah, so in our research, we define intermediaries as the bridge and the connective tissue of the sector. So those are the terms that we use, actually borrowed from and inspired by the conversations that we had. But the slide that we showed where we looked at how intermediaries sort of determine the flow of those different elements, power, relationships. I got to pull up the slide myself to see all of the things. But that's the lens through which we define intermediaries. So relationships, expertise, power, information, and capital, like intermediaries as the organizations that sort of mitigate or moderate the flow of those things throughout the nonprofit ecosystem.
And because we were doing this for MCR, we also had a kind of a subject focus as well, based on the activities that they're engaged in. Jane, I'm curious if you wanted to comment, having been referred to by Lisa and then coming into this as an evaluator, because I think program evaluation is kind of a key thing that it's like in home ownership, the appraisal, right, is something that's often overlooked, but can be a powerful lever. Anyways, if you're feeling so moved, no pressure.
So yeah, a lot of this is resonating. Sorry, I'm off camera, but I'm having to move about here.
No worries.
I mean, so some of the frustrations that I've heard expressed, I understand. I mean, from a different standpoint, because I'm not out there doing the work, but just in terms of trying to, help um, funders understand the role and the importance of some of these pieces as opposed to focusing like specifically or almost exclusively on outcomes, um, not um, not providing perhaps enough support around the foundational work that needs to happen, which is, the relationship building and all of that. Like you said, it takes more time, I think. And I've for decades felt that there's a disconnect between what's realistic and what the expectations are. That I mean, that's a gap that I think can only be closed by continued education. Um, I don't. I mean, so we're not an intermediary. We do work with intermediaries. We work with uh, nonprofit organizations of all sizes. Lisa indicated we work with her for quite a while, as well as philanthropy. So it does give us a chance to see, everything that we've been hearing here.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. I'm also a colleague of Jane's at JFM, and I did want to lift up just more recently, we had an experience where some grantees throughout a particular region were identifying an intermediary, but there were differing opinions. So we hosted sense-making sessions for this initiative, and we quickly learned that the perception of intermediary, which to me makes me think of what Shamil posted moments ago, varies so much because some grantees want intermediaries to do more, or they're perceived as not doing enough. And it's tough work being that bridge, as Janae mentioned. So, in our work in evaluating initiatives, we do get to hear those stories from grantees, and that helps us understand more like what's needed, and hopefully advise in that way.
Felicia, while you're still on, do you feel like the funder, without calling anyone out, do you feel like the funders are asking the right questions? We did a project a couple of years ago, both in Chicago and Detroit, where we're working with cohorts of leaders of collaboratives. And they had very similar issues, different issues, but similar. Hey, we're not properly understood by the people who are funding us. And and we actually got some funders together and had sort of mediated a session with them. I'm wondering if, to your point, do you feel like the funders are looking at intermediaries through the appropriate lens? Shamil, we'll grab you in just a second.
Right. Um, my first answer is I'm not 100% sure, but I will say from as a consultant, we were able to advise in this initiative and hopefully ask the right questions and feed that back to the funder. And so I think that helps. But, again, relationships vary, time varies. I just got the impression that some of those questions had not been asked previously.
And let me just quickly add to that because I know Shamil wants to jump in. In our role as evaluators, we also have limited control and influence. And so it varies from funder to funder. And so I've seen things and I've said, hey, what about this? That, if it doesn't fit into their framework, sometimes, they are not able to take that information in. So it's yeah, it's a mixed bag.
We can very much relate. And it comes back to those power dynamics, right? That were mentioned. Who can, how do you speak truth to power? And there's definitely a different power eventually. Anyways, Shamil, over to you.
So many things. Yes, it does speak to power dynamics, but I think part of the level setting, and I mentioned this in the comments, is that you can't ask the right questions if you don't understand the context. And you can't understand the context if you haven't directly done the work. And again, I think about the most influential, in my opinion, and powerful change-making philanthropic leaders in our region right here in Detroit. And many of them have come from intermediaries doing the work. They understand not only the dynamics of supporting organizations, but they understand the dynamic of being a nonprofit executive and having to do more always with less. And I think part of the major structural tension in philanthropy often is that it categorizes intermediaries as simply another grantee within a portfolio. We are literally in competition with the same organizations that we're serving structurally. From the time that we are submitting grant applications, our grants don't look any different. Our conversations don't look any different, yet the expectations of what we're charged to do, how we're charged to support, is yeoman sheer difference in terms of what is anticipated from traditional grantees, even though from a portfolio standpoint, we look exactly the same. And the challenge, in my opinion, is that it's recognizing us as ecosystem partners that help shape, stabilize, inform, and operationalize their portfolio itself. We are literally the scaffolding that helps to inform their investment strategies, but we're not treated and funded as such. And I think to me, there's a contradiction there. Philanthropy frequently relies on us to increase the effectiveness of their investments while structurally positioning us as subordinate recipients. So I think part of the dynamic, in my opinion, that will help to shift some of that power imbalance is the recognition that we cannot be the only voices on the pulpit complaining about this or advocating for the change. It necessitates consultants, evaluators, Peter and Janae, both of you being able to say, this is what I'm seeing out in the field, and these are the dynamics that are present. And if we want to position intermediaries differently, again, as an anchor and support that increase the investment of philanthropy, that necessitates, to me, a different positioning, one from an investment standpoint, but also structurally in relationship and understanding that there's a power imbalance that exists there.
Yeah, thank you, Shamil, and rest assured, if and when we're asked, we will definitely represent that perspective. I think, and also I just want to emphasize, it's very similar dynamic here in Chicago with program officers that I've observed. Oftentimes, the most effective change makers are those that have come from the other side. I think it should be just like professional development. You know, certain professions you have to do so many hours of professional development. I think program officers should have to do so many hours of or so many years for every year that they're a program officer have to work on the other side. I think we would it would change the profession. Nothing against our career philanthropy folks, but you're right. Without being in those shoes, without having at least a deep empathetic understanding, you can't really get it. Yeah, Janae, anything to share?
So we do have a couple more things to share. Alex, I wasn't sure if you had raised your hand before, or maybe you took it down. And then Lisa, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, maybe if I could just share one question slash perspective. So I am of the opinion that the philanthropic sector, by and large, institutional philanthropy has fallen short of their whatever moral obligation to responsibly invest the charitable resources that they hold, which are massive in relation to what the nonprofit sector has to work with. So with that, on one side, there's something about the difficulty that those of us who define our work as intermediaries or capacity building have had in organizing ourselves in a way to make us a force to be reckoned with or listened to in a more infrastructural way by philanthropy. And that is something that I don't know if you all remember the Alliance for Nonprofit Management. That was like the only national kind of affinity group conference for folks of our ilk. They shut down last year. Like I spent a little time trying to help them do strategic planning and figure out what wasn't working. But even they, like our only affinity group that I was aware of at a national level, could not make it. So I am a little bit perplexed as to why or what it will take or what it could take from us to organize ourselves more effectively to have a more clear theory of change for how intermediaries and capacity builders fit in the ecosystem, what the outcomes we're working towards are, how they are relevant and important to what philanthropy is trying to do. So anyways, I'll just leave it. I just wanted to share my, I guess, interest and kind of search for a space, and which is why I'm so grateful you set this up today, for us to be smarter and more intentional in terms of our organizing together to make a more clear and compelling case for philanthropy in particular.
Thanks, Alex. Janae, do you want to talk about that initiative that was it in Boston that used to convene intermediaries that we talked about?
Yeah, so well, here I am going to name names. The place-based intermediary network that used to be housed at Social Innovation Forum and then later was housed at Radical Partners, one of the organizations that we interviewed, although I'm not telling you which quotes we attribute to them. Um, yeah, so there was this effort to convene these place-based intermediaries at least, and start to build at least a sense of connection, like, oh, we're not out here by ourselves. There's a network of other folks like us. But then the lead funder, their priorities changed. And so the funding to do the work fell off, and therefore the work itself fell off.
I think our observation, though, from the group that we talked to is it's kind of rare. Detroit's kind of and again, I know folks are from all over here, but Detroit's kind of in my opinion, has a very kind of unique intermediary ecosystem. But my impression, Janae, correct me if I'm wrong, is the intermediaries oftentimes are kind of working in isolation wherever they are. And if they do come together, it's over a specific thing. So there's and Shamil knows about this. There's an entity that's bringing legal intermediaries together around stuff that's going on with the Trump administration and attacks on nonprofits and things, right? But beyond that, again, if intermediaries here want to contradict me, but this is our observation, they tend to work very isolated. And I think we had very dynamic conversations with folks because of that. They were like, well, who else did you talk to and what did they tell you? And there does seem to be this desire to share best practices and both challenges and successes along the way. Would you agree with that, Janae?
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a follow-up point to that, but first I want to hear, Lisa, what you had to say.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to comment on the observation that folks that think that having traditional philanthropy program officers and such work in the field. All of my program officers have had anywhere from minimal to extensive field work. And I've even worked shoulder to shoulder with many of them in the work at nonprofits. What happens is the great big old gigantic world of traditional philanthropy littered with racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia usurps them into that system and socializes them into another way and of behaving and understanding nonprofits and intermediaries. The power just looms crazy large, and being able to have those conversations with program officers to bring them back to their observations and what they do know is complicated again by the power dynamic, where you're seeking funding and support, but you're pretty much shaking them by the shoulders and says, "Wake up! You know that's not true. You know that's not how the sector works." And I think it will require folks like Foresight and other folks to lead the charge on that, to have those conversations with more traditional philanthropic organizations, just in terms about how they're socializing and incentivizing their staff, to work to what they know and what their understanding is of the sector and et cetera. So I've never had a program officer that didn't have extensive experience just working on the ground in the nonprofit sector. So yeah, so there's that.
Yeah,
It's
go ahead, Lee. Sorry, I didn't realize you were done. Go ahead.
No, and I think it's about systems, right? And I have to go back to systems and areas. I mean, over 20 years, we've worked in workforce development, youth development, food justice, and those are all the systems, right? And we're set up to really be able to offer, support in those areas. We don't allow traditional philanthropic organizations to cherry pick what they want. Now, one of the things that I think they're valuing more is civic engagement. At least I'm hearing the words put to it. Um, but you can't necessarily come into we say that we have a suite of services that we offer. We don't allow them to be cherry picked. They all go together. Our re-granting funds, are just as important, and they go hand in hand with our technical assistance. You can't choose one without the other.
Yeah.
So I think that goes to infrastructure and how we see ourselves, right? So yeah.
Lisa,
Thanks so much, Lisa. So go ahead.
so
Whoever that
sorry.
was.
Lisa,
Go
I
ahead, Chanel.
appreciate you offering that perspective as well. That has not been my direct experience. I think more often than not, the program officers have not had as much direct experience. But you actually did name something that I observed when I went to the CMF conference, the Council for Michigan Foundations conference, and typically nonprofits have not been invited into the space. I was grateful that in the last year or two, some of our intermediary organizations have been allowed to attend because either we were presenting, et cetera. But what the dynamic that I observed was most certainly some program officers and other philanthropic professionals feeling as though their hands were tied, just based on the culture, based on their inability to shift what they knew needed to change and what that meant in terms of their own dynamics within their organizations. And it was sort of this tension point between what can we do on the outside, even in physical space with them, as they're wrestling with, to your point, holding them on the shoulders and say, you know better. But then this question of what can they do within the confines of power, dynamics and control, et cetera. So I appreciate you bringing that into the space just as a reminder that even when they know better, the question is, can they do better based on the dynamics of their own individual organizations?
Yeah, so appreciate that, Shamil. I think one of the things that we've identified, and we can talk offline, that Janae and I, is the most powerful entities in this system, right? The board of directors of foundations are also invisible, untouchable, unknowable. And so if you want to influence the real power dynamics, how do you access that level? Janae and I don't have this figured out, but we've at least identified it as an issue, and we're scratching our heads about it, figuratively speaking. Janae?
Yeah, so we don't have time to get to this today, but we also put together some thoughts around this building a more vibrant and innovative sort of intermediary ecosystem. You can check those out when we send you the slides and the recording if you so wish. Also, I'm gonna end up dropping this in the chat. Actually, I'll just send it out in the follow-up email, but one of the folks who we spoke with wrote a great article that touches on a lot of what we've discussed today. You might want to check that out. And then we certainly want to invite you to join us for other installments in our Responding to the Moment series. So we kicked it off with intermediaries. Next time we'll be talking about strategic planning. And actually, I guess in the follow-up, we'll also send you a link to we have a video podcast called Yes, Yes, and where we have an episode where we talk specifically about strategic planning and why don't even call us trying to hire us to do your strategic plan.
Should you do it? Or if not, what?
Yeah. Yeah, we talk about alternatives. But in any case, we want to thank you for joining, invite you to stay connected with us. Like I said, we will be sending out a follow-up email. And yeah, I mean, on the one hand, this is a unique moment. It seems like a moment of disruption in our sector based on everything that went down in 2025. At the same time, we're not pretending, you're not pretending everything was great before and that we didn't have work to do. So we are so glad to have had you in this space to think about how we might do that work together. On that note, it's 1:15. We're at time. So proud of us for ending on time. Thank you for your candor and for being here, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank y'all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.